The Terminator. A tale of a killer cyborg going back in time to try and murder the mother of the future savior of mankind. Truly, an 80s classic. When it was still in production, I don't think anyone could have guessed that this movie would lead to such a massive franchise, filled with multiple movies, video games, and even a TV show. The problem, though, with making a movie about time travel is that when you start getting into the nitty-gritty details with the timelines, and keep adding new parts to the story, things are going to get a bit confusing, and this series is a masterclass at doing that.
Trust me.
Now, I've always been a big fan of this series, and I've honestly lost track of how many times I've watched the first movie alone. So for this video, I thought it would be fun to go through and explain the main movie timelines, and then discuss which one I personally enjoy the most. This video isn't to talk smack about any of the sequels. Trust me, I'll dive into that dumpster some other time. I only want to go over what's considered canon in the movies, and what I personally think is the best story out of all of them. So without further ado, let's get into this. So the series' first timeline starts with the Terminator and ends with Terminator 2: Judgment Day. In this timeline, humanity is fighting a war against an AI defense network known as Skynet in the distant future of... Anyway, Skynet is losing this war, so in a desperate move to prevent its destruction, the rogue AI sends an infiltration unit, also known as a T-800, back to 1984 to kill the mother of the resistance leader, John Connor, and prevent him from ever leading humanity to victory. Unfortunately for Skynet, it won't be easy, as the resistance is able to send a Guardian back to 1984 to protect John's mother, Sarah Connor. This Guardian's name is Kyle Reese, one of John's most trusted and loyal fighters. After years of hearing stories about Sarah from John, Kyle ends up falling in love with her and volunteers for the job. When he finally catches up with Sarah and explains what's going on, she doesn't take it well initially. However, after a couple of days of being together, the love becomes mutual, and we realize that John knew that his father was Kyle Reese, and he had to ensure that he didn't change. We also learn that there is no such thing as fate. The future is what we make of it. In the end, Kyle dies protecting Sarah, and she delivers the final blow to put down the Terminator for good.
You're terminated, fucker!
She realizes she's pregnant and goes on the run to ensure she can't be tracked by another time-traveling cyborg. We fast forward to the year 1995. John Connor is 10 years old and in the care of foster parents, as Sarah is being held in a mental asylum after trying to destroy a computer company in an attempt to change the future and stop Judgment Day. This time around, 2 Terminators are sent back in time. Another T-800, this time reprogrammed by the Resistance to protect John, and the T-1000, a more sophisticated Terminator model, made of liquid metal. With the help of the T-800, John is able to survive his encounter with the T-1000 and break Sarah out of her captivity.
Come with me if you want to live.
After learning more about Skynet's origins from the T-800, the two learn about Miles Dyson, the creator of the microprocessor that would lead to Skynet's creation. Miles is able to do this with the pieces of the first T-800 that made it out of the crusher. With Kyle's words of no fate spiraling in her head, Sarah decides to go after Miles and kill him herself. John and the T-800 go after her to try and stop her, but Sarah ends up realizing that she is not in fact a machine and can't go through with it. Despite all of this, Miles decides to help them destroy the facility he works at, after learning about what all of his research leads to. After a run-in with the LA SWAT team and another visit from the T-1000,
Get out!
Miles gets injured and sacrifices himself to destroy the facility. Sarah and the T-800 work together to destroy the T-1000, and after all pieces of the original T-800 are destroyed, Sarah and John woefully destroy the reprogrammed T-800, destroying all of the existing pieces of Skynet. We then flash forward to a different 2029. The date of Judgment Day came and went, but the bombs never dropped. Sarah and John have grown older, John has a child of his own, and he becomes a senator rather than a military leader. Humanity is safe from destruction, at least until some other genius decides to create his or her own version of an AI that decides that humans must be eradicated. But for now, all's well that ends well. So I guess in summary, I see this timeline as a never-ending loop that was finally broken. Originally, Skynet sent back 2 Terminators, one to try and kill Sarah, and one to try and kill John. The Resistance would send 2 protectors of their own back in time. Sarah would survive and go on to train John for the inevitable future, and Skynet would be created from the remnants of the first T-800. John, Sarah, and the reprogrammed T-800 would survive, and Judgment Day always happens in 1997. Humanity wins the war in 2029 after the Terminators fail their missions, and humanity rebuilds from there. However, because Sarah and John opted to destroy Skynet this time around, rather than just wait around and prepare for the inevitable, it breaks up that loop and allows for a new timeline that prevents Judgment Day from ever happening. Unfortunately, the next timeline isn't quite as hopeful. The second timeline takes us from the Terminator all the way to Terminator Salvation. In this timeline, everything from Terminator 1 and 2 still happened. The only difference is that we follow T2's more open-ended theatrical ending.
The unknown future rolls toward us. I face it for the first time with a sense of hope. Because of a machine, a Terminator can learn the value of human life. Maybe we can too.
After the events of Terminator 2 in 1995, we jump ahead to 2004. Not wanting to take any chances of being found, John lives the life of a nomad, picking up work where he can, but constantly staying on the move. Unfortunately, Sarah died from cancer in 1997, but she lived long enough to see that their efforts weren't in vain, as Judgment Day didn't happen when it was supposed to. Skynet still exists, and because it can't track down John's whereabouts, it decides to send a Terminator back to kill his lieutenants, including a woman named Catherine Brewster, who just so happens to have John trapped in a kennel at the animal hospital she works at, as John had previously broken in to try and find painkillers after a motorcycle accident. The TX finds Catherine and realizes that John is there with her. Luckily for them, a T-850 was sent back in time to protect them. After getting away from the TX, the T-850 reveals that Judgment Day was only delayed. It's something that inevitably must happen. Turns out, though, Catherine's dad is a general in the U.S. Air Force who was put in charge of getting Skynet up and running again, and recently, a virus has popped up that affects all electronics nationwide, and the chief of staff is pushing him closer and closer to activating it. Catherine and John realize that only he can stop Skynet from booting up, and John orders the T-850 to take them to him. When the T-850 denies the request, Catherine then orders him to take them to him, and so he does. So after making a quick pit stop to Sarah's grave to pick up some firepower, and after dealing with another run-in with the TX, the group goes to try and stop Skynet for good. We later learn that Catherine and John are married in the future, and the reason why the T-850 took orders from Catherine, but not John, is because this T-850 was sent to kill John in the future and succeeded with its mission. So, after it was captured, it was actually Catherine who had him reprogrammed and sent back in time to protect their past selves. The group eventually makes it to General Brewster's location, but they're too late. Not only did the TX beat them there, but Brewster already powered up Skynet. In the confusion of Skynet becoming self-aware, the TX kills General Brewster, and with his final breath, he tells John and Catherine where they can go to shut down Skynet for good, an old facility in the Sierra Nevada known as Crystal Peak. The T-850 puts up a good one-on-one fight with the TX, but ends up losing and getting reprogrammed to attack John. After our heroes escape the TX, the T-850 nearly kills John, until it's finally able to reboot its systems, allowing Catherine and John to get to Crystal Peak. From here, the TX tries one last time to kill John and Catherine, but the T-850 shows up at the last second to help them get into the facility and finally put down the TX for good, while also sacrificing himself in the process.
You are terminated.
John and Catherine look around the facility, but realize that the technology is outdated, and none of it could possibly shut down Skynet. They realize that General Brewster had sent them there to ensure that they would survive the inevitable nuclear attack and go on to fight another day, because as it turns out, the future is in fact set. About a year before the bombs dropped in 2003, a death row inmate named Marcus Wright donates his body to Cyberdyne Systems for scientific research after his execution. We'll get back to Marcus in a bit, but when we catch up with John Connor again, it's 2018. He's not quite the leader of the Resistance yet, but he is becoming a sort of legend to the survivors in California. At the moment, he's leading a mission into a Skynet base where he learns of a plot to capture humans and use their living tissue for a new type of Terminator, the T-800. While he's doing that, the current resistance leaders believe that they have found a specific signal that can shut down Skynet's machines and end the war. They also discovered a kill list that had John and a teenager named Kyle Reese as two of the top targets. John learns this and realizes that he needs to find Kyle sooner rather than later. Marcus wakes up and works his way through an unfamiliar new world. In the process, he runs into Kyle, and they work together to try and find their way to the resistance base, despite Marcus's initial protests. Kyle gets abducted by Skynet, and after Marcus fails to rescue him, he works his way to the resistance base with the help of a downed A-10 pilot that he rescued. When he finally arrives, Marcus is injured after an electromagnetic mine goes off and knocks him out. As Catherine Brewster, now Catherine Connor, and other resistance members try to help him, they see that Marcus is actually a cyborg with living tissue and partially human cerebral cortex. Marcus tries to convince John and Catherine that he's human, but they think that he was sent to kill John, so they decide to execute him. With the help of the pilot Marcus rescued, he's able to escape the execution. Connor and the guards chase him down, and in the pursuit, Marcus ends up saving John's life, and convinces him to let Marcus help save Kyle. When they get to Skynet's headquarters, Marcus learns that Skynet used him to lure John there. He also learns that the signal the Resistance discovered is a trap, and when they set it off, Skynet tracks down the Resistance command sub and destroys it. Marcus refuses to be a part of Skynet's plan, so he breaks the link between himself and the AI and goes to help John. They find Kyle, but are attacked by a brand new T-800. John and Marcus put up a good fight, but John is injured, leaving Marcus to destroy the Terminator and the entire facility. When the group gets back to the Resistance base, the doctors reveal that John needs a heart transplant in order to survive. So, Marcus offers his, sacrificing himself, but saving John in the process. So that's how this timeline ends, and like I said before, this timeline isn't quite as hopeful as the original. The message it tries to tell is that the future is set, and nothing you will do can change that. In this timeline, I would have to say that everything was a constant loop, until John, Sarah, and the T-800 destroyed Cyberdyne systems. This caused everything to delay. The war continued even after the first two Terminators were sent back. But if Judgment Day is inevitable, then humanity winning the war is inevitable. So even though Skynet successfully kills John Connor in the future, Catherine sending back the T-850 ensured that the timeline wouldn't change again. It just sucks for Salvation's John Connor because he knows that he has to send Kyle back and the T-800, but he doesn't know when the T-850 will kill him. At least that's how I assume things play out. Salvation was supposed to be the start of a new trilogy, but nothing ever came of it. So now we move on to the third timeline. So this third one starts, and ends I guess, with Terminator Genisys. It's a complete reboot of the series, and gets rid of all of the continuity that we have so far, bringing the story back to the first Terminator movie. We start things off in 2029. Humanity is making the final push into Skynet's HQ to destroy it for good. Just before they complete their mission, Skynet sends a T-800, the original from the first movie, back to 1984 to try and kill Sarah Connor. As we all know, Kyle Reese volunteers to go back to protect her, and John gives him the go-ahead. Just as Kyle is about to go back in time, though, a Resistance fighter attacks John. This throws everything out of whack and causes a temporal paradox to happen, making Kyle experience childhood memories of a life he never lived. When the T-800 gets to 1984, everything happens as you'd expect. That is, until an older T-800 shows up, and the two proceed to fight. Sarah is working with him, so with her help, the good T-800, who Sarah affectionately calls Pops, take out the evil T-800, and bring it with them as they go to find Kyle. Meanwhile, when Kyle gets to 1984, everything seems to be going the same as it did before, until the police officer who stops Kyle turns out to be a T-1000. He's rescued by Sarah and Pops, and the three work together to kill the T-1000. Sarah then explains that this T-1000 had been hunting her since she was a child, but some unknown person sent Pops back in time to protect her. She's made a makeshift time machine, and plans on going to 1997 to destroy Skynet for good. Kyle convinces her that he's been having these flashbacks telling him that Skynet is now called Genisys, and that the timeline has changed. So they alter course, and decide to travel to 2017 instead. When they get to 2017, Skynet is now called Genisys, just as Kyle said. And they run into John Connor, of all people. Pop shows up and attacks John. Turns out, the resistance soldier that attacked John was actually Skynet in a physical disguise, and it transformed John into a T-3000. His purpose now is only to protect the development of Genesis. Sarah and Kyle's mission is to destroy Genesis's mainframe, and John does everything he can to stop them. In the end, Pops is able to trap John in a prototype time machine, destroying the two Terminators. Kyle and Sarah place bombs and destroy the facility, preventing Genesis from going online. Miraculously, Pops comes back, with upgrades similar to that of a T-1000. This was because just before the time machine exploded, Pops' remains were flung out and landed in experimental mimetic polyalloy, essentially the liquid metal that T-1000s are made out of. And the three travel to Kyle's childhood home to relay the messages he heard in his visions to his younger self. We also learn that Genesis's system core was not destroyed, meaning that Skynet, or Genesis, still possesses a future threat to humanity. So that was just a quick rundown of things, and obviously this was supposed to start a new line of movies, but nothing really ever came of it. We're left with a lot of questions that will forever go unanswered, like, who sent Pops? How did Skynet send the T-1000 so early? Where did the disguised Terminator come from? If Skynet was able to turn John Connor into a Terminator, wouldn't that mean that Skynet's already won? Genesis sits on its own timeline, never to be touched again because it just didn't do very well in theaters. So all we're left with is confusion and a whole lot of questions. The last timeline we'll look at in the series once again starts with the Terminator and takes us to Terminator 2 and finally to Terminator Dark Fate. This timeline also follows T2's more open-ended theatrical ending, but this time we can say for sure that Skynet has actually been destroyed. The story begins in 1998 in Guatemala with John and Sarah celebrating the fact that Judgment Day never happened. That is, until a brand new T-800 shows up and ambushes the two. He murders John, and then leaves without a purpose, now that his mission is complete, as Skynet has apparently sent multiple Terminators throughout time, rather than just the two. We move forward 22 years later. In the year that shall not be discussed, a new type of Terminator, known as the Rev-9, gets sent back to kill a girl named Dani Ramos. To put it simply, Dani is the new John Connor. To protect her, a cybernetically enhanced resistance soldier named Grace is sent back from 2042. The two end up running into Sarah Connor, and learn that she's been hunting Terminators for the last 2 decades, with the help of an anonymous source, giving her the location of these machines. Grace traces the source of these anonymous messages and reveals that John Connor and Skynet aren't known in the future that she comes from. Now, the AI goes by the name Legion. After she learns who is sending the messages, they go to Texas to find this mysterious source. Turns out, it's the T-800 that killed John back in 1998. Similar to the T-800 in Terminator 2, this one learned how to be more quote-unquote human, and lives the life of a regular family man named Carl. He apparently developed a conscience and decided to warn Sarah every time it detected temporal displacements. Despite Sarah's obvious hatred for the machine, the group teams up with him, and they work together to destroy the Rev-9. It's through this teamwork it takes them to a hydroelectric plant for the final showdown. In the final fight with the Rev-9, Grace reveals that Dani will be the future leader that saves mankind. Grace ends up getting fatally injured and gives Dani her power source to kill the Terminator. With the help of Carl, Dani stabs the Rev-9 and it, along with Carl, are destroyed when they fall into the power plant's core. Sarah and Dani leave, and sometime later, see young Grace playing at a playground. The two plan to try to save Grace and change the future again, knowing that there is a lot more work to be done. So this timeline shows us that no matter what we do to try and prevent it, mankind will always try to find a way to destroy itself. John and Sarah were able to change the future, but some knuckleheads still decided that AI needed to be put in charge of military systems at some point in the timeline. Similar to Genesis, though, it leaves a few unanswered questions. The biggest one that comes to mind is if Skynet doesn't exist anymore, how are there still Terminators pursuing John in the 90s? Alas, it looks like we'll never know, as rumors say the series is once again going in a different direction. Each Terminator film tries something new and are different in their own ways. But the one thing that all of these movies share is a warning sign about the dangers of AI and how much it can cost us. That's probably why Tesla's showing of its robots made me a bit nervous. but it still looks like we're a ways away from any Terminator or iRobot situations ever happening. So at least there's that. If you were to ask me which movie timeline I like the best, which, of course you did, that was one of the two main points of this video, I think that it's safe to say that I like the first timeline the best. Sure, it's the cleanest and less confusing of the bunch, and probably everybody else's, but I also like the message that it pushes, which is nothing is set in stone. If you don't want your future to go a certain direction, you can change it for the better, if you're willing to put in the work for it. However, the timeline I think I really enjoy the most is the timeline between Terminator 1, 2, and Terminator Resistance, the game. In this timeline, everything is just really a constant loop. The events of Terminator 1 and 2 happen, and Resistance shows us the events that led up to the final battle with Skynet. From there, we see how everything falls into place for John to send Kyle and the T-800 back in time to protect him and his mother. From there, humanity gets to live on and rebuild society, without the threat of a murderous AI glooming around them. If you haven't played it yet, I really suggest you do. It's a very faithful story, made as a sort of love letter for the fans of the series. Well, that's about all I've got for this video. Do you have a favorite timeline? Any theories about any of these timelines? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I've got more Terminator and non-Terminator-esque videos in the works, so I guess you could say,
I'll be back.
But until then, don't forget to like the video, if you did, and hit that subscribe button. I'll catch you later. And remember,
There is no fate but what we make for ourselves.